We're now joined from Cairo by Mohamed Ezz El-Deen, who is the managing editor of Al-Ahram Newspaper. Thank you for joining us today. Now, we were hearing there in our news bulletin, GHF, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, run by Israel and the United States, says that there have been no incidents at their sites. We know that's not true. We know that Gazans are being shot as they are approaching for aid. What would you say is the humanitarian situation on the ground now in Gaza?
Thank you so much for having me on Qnews. Certainly what is being stated by the GHF is untrue. There has been incidents of several shootings and they were actually, there are footage to prove that, and there are troops waiting for seekers to shoot them, in addition to designating distribution points at very distant areas. And definitely these incidents happened, and it's an attempt to beautify the image after the killing hundreds of Palestinians seeking aid, and hundreds and thousands have fallen wounded. Certainly the system applied by the GHF to provide Palestinians with aid is a completely failed system, and the humanitarian aid is not nearly sufficient to the volume of need. Also, there is unprofessionalism in designating the hours during which these distribution centers operate. Also, there is a lot of risk on the population in going to these points, in addition to the insufficient distribution points or the volume of aid being distributed. There is insistence by the international community.
Let me just ask you about that, can I? Because you mentioned there the amount of aid that's getting into Gaza is another problem, as well as the GHF. What is preventing the safe delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza, despite recent agreements that have been made by Israel?
Of course, there is a state of confusion regarding the GHF, in addition to the complete military intervention by the Israeli troops and the US side regarding the intelligence or providing info to the Israeli military. Here is all about the unprofessionalism of this organization to provide aid, the lack of expertise, and the insufficient volume of aid. Also exposing the lives of civilians to risk during obtaining aid. They fall either killed or wounded. Also, the quality of the aid being distributed is very poor, and this has been cited. And there is also the Israeli troops wants to militarize and occupy several regions in the Gaza Strip and providing certain corridors, or the reviving the Mirage corridor that was abdicated in 2005. They are relaunching it once again to control the fate of Palestinians and to supervise the entire Gaza Strip, regardless of aid distribution or providing services to civilian Palestinians.
Okay, and could you tell us perhaps what are the or if there are ever going to be any legal or even diplomatic consequences that Israel could face following the UN statements about attacks on Gazans as they're trying to get to aid sites? Hungry people trying to visit these aid distribution centers are being killed, as we've both talked about. Are they ever going to get anything happen to Israel as a result of this?
Yes, so there is a campaign being launched now by the European Union to boycott Israel and to suspend trade agreements with Israel. Also, halting the military supplies and going through all the trade agreements and economic agreements signed into with the occupation state. And there is also international pressures to prosecute Israeli officials, on top of whom Benjamin Netanyahu, and to revive the legal prosecution of the Israeli Prime Minister. There is a political pressure by the Israel supporting states or the Middle East regions that are being harmed by the Israeli policies. Also, the mediators, Egypt and Qatar, are exerting pressures on the Israeli side to accept a ceasefire, a permanent ceasefire. The statements issued by Benjamin Netanyahu regarding a temporary ceasefire only to bring back the detainees and then they can resume operations are very conflicted, and apparently there isn't a comprehensive agreement, and unfortunately so far the United States has not practiced the due pressure on Israel to impose a ceasefire agreement, and that's why we haven't seen a ceasefire yet or a humanitarian aid access without militarization or occupation of the strip or attempts to evacuate the population.
And you mentioned there the EU's new restrictive measures, including potentially an arms embargo. How might this affect Israel's military operations? Will it have any effect at all? And also, how will it affect its relationship with Europe?
The relations between Israel and Europe has been ongoing, but there is a popular efforts being popular pressures being exerted against the European governments to that are forcing politicians to give in to this domestic pressures. The Israeli practices in Gaza and in Palestine in general is way out of humanitarian frameworks, and consequently all the agreements or most agreements are now around being threatened as politicians have to answer to the public opposition in their countries. Of course, a weapon embargo will impact the occupation state drastically, and since October 7th, the Israeli economy has been very affected in spite of the US support, and the Israeli trade was very impacted by this. That's why the opposition inside Israel, in addition to the domestic pressures by the families of detainees, are now seeking a ceasefire and to bring back the detainees. Of course, the international pressure and the European pressure on Israel will have an economic and political impact. Also, we have seen a decline in the potentials to expand the Abraham Accord, as the Gulf states fear taking this path without finding a political solution for the Palestinian cause.
Well, thank you very much, Mohamed Ezz El-Deen, managing editor of Al-Ahram Newspaper. Thank you very much for joining us here on Q News.